You saw how he avoided singing, by staying outside. Okay, great. I was talking to Tony about the lesson this morning before. It's from Paul's letter to the Romans. And I was telling him that before I would teach Romans again, I would get sick. I'll tell you, when you're talking about theology, that's deep. I mean, the water gets real deep, real quick. And so in preparing the lesson, I haven't plagiarized. Plagiarism is when you copy from one author. But when you steal from several authors, it's called
recording in progress.
I've stolen freely. So our lesson is freedom from sin, and it's from Romans chapter 6, 1 through 14. Now let me give some background to the book of Romans. It's considered the most significant letter of theology written, certainly in the Bible. And Holman's Bible commentary noted this, that Martin Luther concluded after reading Romans that faith alone justifies a person before God. And Paul wrote the letter when he was about to leave for Jerusalem. And so that Paul wrote the letter while in Greece. Now, scholars believe that the letter was written somewhere between 54 and 59 AD. Now, the purpose was that Paul had the desire to visit Christians in Rome. He hadn't visited them before. He hadn't started the church. And he announced his visit, and he was asking for their prayers. Now, Brad Trick, who taught the lesson on Romans some years back, said that there were actually two tenement churches in Rome. One was a Jewish Christian who had converted, and the other was the Gentiles, but they were kind of separate. And sometimes they were at odds. The church that brought up with Jewish converts wanted, in effect, how much do we take over from the Jewish religion? How about the dietary laws? How about the circumcision? Is that required before you become a member of our church? You have to be circumcised and all that. And so Paul wanted to bring the two tenement churches, together under one. And he was saying that that's not important, that Christ is important. Now, when he said tenement, what's a tenement? When I think of tenement, it's in perhaps a not very prosperous section of town, multi-story, kids burning tires in the street. It's not something that's pleasant. But there have been some archaeological digs from about this period. And generally, the tenements were organized something like this. On the ground floor, you'd have the mom and pop business. You know what I mean? Whether it was selling clothing, used clothing, whether it was selling tents, whatever. The floor above it would be their warehouse, where they kept the goods that they were to sell or to repair or whatever. The third floor up was the kind of great room that covered the whole building. That's where the family had its meals. That's where they had meetings. That's where they brought people together. The upper floor, the bedroom floor, was not like the bedrooms we have today, where there's one central hallway with bedrooms off. There was a series of hallways, about 3, and they were very narrow, and the sleeping areas were like a very limited, very small sleeping areas. So those were the tenements, perhaps from this day. Now, it's not scriptural. We don't know exactly the tenement that Crick was talking about, or that Paul would have written the letters to. But Paul's purpose is to bring the two groups together under one. Now, it really is an understatement that theology is deep. It's real deep. There are themes of righteousness and justification, not only what Paul means, but how he means it. In other words, what does he use? What devices does he use to try to get his message across? Now, our text is from, as I said, Romans 6, 1 through 14. And I will read that. And notice the way he reasons and the way he develops his themes. Chapter 1. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Jesus Christ were baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him, so that the body of sin might be destroyed, and we might no longer be enslaved to sin. For whoever has died is freed from sin. But if we have died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We know that Christ, being raised from the dead, will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. The death he died to sin once for all. But the life he lives to God. So you must also consider yourselves dead to sin and alive to God in Jesus Christ. Therefore, do not let sin exercise dominion in your mortal bodies to make you obey your passions. No longer present your members to sin as instruments of wickedness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members to God as instruments of righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you were not under law, but under grace. Y'all understand that, I'm sure. See what problems I have. Now, first of all, what's righteousness? And what it means to us today is not necessarily what it meant in the Bible. When we think of modern English usage of righteousness, we think of obeying or conforming to an established norm. What will other people think of us or expect from us regarding our behavior? That's the established norm. Rules, morals, anything you want to put under that. It's modern usage of righteousness. But in the Bible, righteousness means more. It's rooted in covenants and relationships. It is a covenant between God and humanity and our relationships with others. What does God do for us? What do we do for God? What do we do for others? And for Paul, our righteousness is absolute faith and commitment to God, to Christ. A person who in faith gives oneself to what God's will, what is God's will, is righteous. We do and we receive. In a covenant relationship, there are two sides to it. Both sides render to the other like that. And a person who in faith gives oneself to what's God's will is righteous. We do, we receive. Now for Paul, the righteousness of God is key to understanding our salvation, entering the kingdom. God requires and God gives. And how do we as Christians bring ourselves into a right relationship with God? The early Christians believed that they were made right with God through death and the resurrection of Christ. But Paul in chapter 6 delivers the message that God does not consider sin lightly. In other words, the thought was that if we're going to be forgiven by God's grace, then why not sin more and more in life and we'll get more and more grace? And Paul said that does not follow. But Paul declares the message that God does not consider sin very lightly. And later in the chapter 6, there's the great quote that is not included. The wages of sin is death. And so how do we obtain a right relationship with God? What do? And we we know that we all sin one way or another. And that while sin has power over all of us, we have to think, have we ever been tempted to do wrong? Have you ever been tempted to, in other words, that you wanted to get something so badly that you were willing to do whatever's necessary to get it? And our sin separates us from God. And we all need to be delivered from what separates us from God. Now, Christ's crucifixion and death, and Christ being without sin, puts us right with God through our faith in him. And in one sense, God loves us and shares our suffering. Crucifixion shows that. Another, since he was blameless, he takes on our sin. We've sinned. He hasn't. Paul advises us to live as Jesus would want us to live. So how do we do that? And the fullest expression is in the chapter, the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew. And the old law was love your neighbors, hate your enemies. But Christ says, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. It's something totally different than what the older law was. The older law was steeped in ritual. You had to obey these dietary laws. You had to do this, you had to do that. But he was talking on a very, Christ was teaching us on a different level. It was that we must love our neighbors. That we have to grow from within, not do these rituals. And so how does Paul get his message across? And why is it important? Now, everybody's heard the term rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is how you write in a particular pattern so that people can understand you better, okay? And then two, if you use a pattern, then they're more apt to remember it, right? That's what he wants. And so it's used not only to convince others, but so they'll be able to remember. Now, how do you do? What's the rhetoric that Paul uses? There's metaphor, there's simile, there's personification, hyperbole, assonance, dissonance. And then two, it's central to Jewish thought of parallelism. Now, what's the clearest example of parallelism? Well, you place things side by side and notice the comparisons or differences, okay? Parallelism. Now, in the clearest one would be Christ's great series of parables, where you have the lost coin, then the lost sheep, they search until they find it, and then the lost son, the prodigal son, in a pattern. Now, in the pattern that he's got, it's not an easy comparison. You've got two sons, okay, and the father. One son is hardworking, stays on the family farm, the firstborn, but the other son figures, what have I got to lose? He wants his inheritance now, and he goes to a foreign country, wasted on prostitutes and everything else. And then he realizes when he runs out of money that he's destroying, he comes back home. Now, our sympathies are with the hardworking brother, aren't they? I mean, he's the one that's done the work, stayed on the farm, done what's required for him, take care of his parents. The other son has wasted what he had. The father sees him coming, runs out to meet him, puts his own cloak on the son who was sinned, and kills the fatted calf and has a celebration in the hall. Now, at this point, the brother who's done all the hard work wants to know why, if you're treating him this way. I've never been treated that way. I've never had a celebration for my friends. How come he gets all the gifts? And the father reassures him. And Bob Lewis said in one of his lessons on the parable, he said it shows the heart of God, and that he loves them both. the Father loves them both. Now, the interesting thing about the parable is, what does the hardworking brother do? Does he join into the hall of celebration or stay outside? Now, John, in his lesson, we quoted Matthew Perry from some over 300 years ago, and his commentary on the Bible. And his commentary on it, on the prodigal son, was that the brother who's hardworking actually has some things that are wrong with it. He's stuffed with pride. I know I want what's coming from me. You need to give me this, you need to give me that. And in the parable, Christ is showing how we enter the kingdom. If it's an allegory, the Father is God. And the two sons, everybody. And so whether the hardworking son steps across the doorway into the entry, we don't know, because the other brother, in a little bit, is like us, boasting with pride. We want this, we want that. So you don't know. So the decision is ours. The parable is complicated, and it's the placing it side by side. Paul uses that rhetorical device, and he also uses something called a syllogism. And in the syllogism, it's a logical device where you have statement A and then statement B, which taken together will lead to a conclusion, section C. Okay? And Christ died, we all die. Christ rose from the dead, we will rise with him. So you got these rhetorical things. And then, of course, you got the rhetorical question. It's a question that you ask, even though you know the person listening to it knows the answer. Okay? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? That would be a rhetorical question. He knows the answer to it. We all do. Now, how do we summarize all this? And I've used from Harold Willington his particular summary of what chapter 6 is really doing. He said, Paul introduces God's threefold method leading to sanctification. What is to be sanctified? Getting right with God. Step 1, no. Believers must be aware of 3 facts. We have been crucified with Christ. They have been crucified with Christ. They are now both dead and alive. Dead to their sin. We should no longer be slaves to sin, for we have been crucified with Christ. We're alive in the Savior. We are now to live in the resurrection power of the one who rose from the dead and is forever alive. Step 2 would be the reckoning. We are to count our crucifixion and resurrection as accomplished events. And 3, Paul describes 2 kinds of yielding. The wrong kind, we are not to yield members of the body as tools of wickedness, to sin. The right kind is that God's grace has set us free from the law. Does it mean we can go on sinning? And of course not. We cannot sin continually. Sin leads to death. And the challenge, we are to yield members of our body as tools of righteousness. The wages of sin are death. The free gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. That's how Paul's theology unfolds and the devices that he uses to be able to do it. I ran across, I thought about a poem from a Victorian poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson. And he had suffered a terrible illness, life-threatening, toward the end of his life. And he was able to recover from it. And he wrote a short poem called Crossing the Bar. And in the particular poem, it's really a metaphor. You have, when the ship goes out to sea from a harbor and it meets the ocean current, there's a bar of real rough water that the ship has to traverse to get to the other side, to get to the ocean. So that's what the metaphor is in crossing the bar. So this is what Tennyson wrote. And After writing this, he insisted that whenever anybody published a series of his poems, they had to include this one as the last one. So, crossing the bar, sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems to sleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening veil, and after that the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. And of course, the pilot would be Christ in this poem. A wonderful poem, Tennyson. Money, honeys.
Wasn't it?
Had it already. Yeah. Remember, next week we'll meet in the fellowship hall, and Pastor Laura is going to teach. And we're all looking forward to that. Right. Well, listen, later, after this goes around, Bob Bertram's going to do the final prayer. Whenever I think of Bob Bertram, you know, Bob was a urologist, was retired, and there's a certain test that say that close your ears, nurse, that men have to go through. You know what I'm talking about? Cough. And they
Sure missed that.
They had this nurse out there. I think they called her Brunhilde. I'm not sure. She slapped me around, pushed me on the table. Oh, I'm kidding. Oh, goodness. Was the plate been around? Great.
Yeah.
Let us stand and be dismissed. Bob will give our final prayer.
Lord, thank you for your many blessings. As always, for a chance to get together, study, and hear your word to our teachers. Please help us absorb these words and to further your work and move into the coming week. Please look after and be with those who are suffering around the world, especially in Ukraine, where they are suffering the indescribable horrors and atrocities of war. And be with our youth today as they prepare to lead us in worship. Sunday we always look forward to. Please guide and direct us in your name. Amen.
Amen.
From the record, buddy.